I am Imani, 35 years old, and on the night of my birthday, my father looked me dead in the eye and handed me an eviction notice instead of a card. He told me I was a burden and needed to make room for my sister and her husband. What my family did not realize as they threw me out of the basement I had paid to renovate was that I am a forensic accountant who already had full access to their darkest financial secrets. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to bankrupt your toxic family lies to buy back your own peace. The dining room table was set with my mother's best china, the plates she only brought out when she wanted to impress the pastor or pretend we were old money. It was supposed to be a celebration. I had just turned 35, and despite working 60-hour weeks at a top-tier accounting firm downtown, I had rushed home to have dinner with my parents, Charles and Brenda. My younger sister Jasmine was there too, sitting next to her white husband Connor. Connor was wearing a blazer over a t-shirt, swirling his wine glass, and talking loudly about his latest cryptocurrency investments. I sat quietly eating the dry pot roast my mother had prepared, waiting for someone to acknowledge why we were gathered. There was no cake. There were no balloons. Finally, my father cleared his throat. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, and slid a crisp white envelope across the mahogany wood. I smiled genuinely, thinking it was a birthday card. Perhaps a gift certificate to a spa, or even just a thoughtful handwritten note. I picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a formal typed 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I stared at the black ink, my brain struggling to process the legal jargon. I looked up at my father. His expression was completely blank, a mask of righteous authority. "You are a burden, Imani," my father said, his voice carrying the same booming cadence he used when he read scripture at Sunday service. "It is time you stop leeching off us. You are a grown woman living in your parents' basement. Connor and Jasmine need the suite for their new startup. They are building a real legacy and they need the space to operate." The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. I looked at Jasmine. She was 32 years old, the undeniable golden child of the family, wearing a designer dress I knew for a fact was purchased on a maxed-out credit card. She had the decency to look down at her plate, but she did not say a word to defend me. Connor, however, leaned forward with a sickening smirk. "It is just business, Imani," he said, using that condescending tone he always reserved for me. "My new tech venture needs a dedicated headquarters. You are single. You have no kids. You can just go get a little apartment somewhere. You really do not need all that space down there anyway." My mother Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with that toxic mix of maternal concern and absolute manipulation. "Do not be dramatic, Imani," she said, reaching over to pat my hand, though her grip felt more like a restraint. "We just need to prioritize Jasmine and her family right now. Lord knows we have let you stay here out of the goodness of our hearts. You should be grateful we gave you a roof over your head this long. It is your duty as the older sister to step aside and support Black wealth building." I sat in absolute silence, absorbing the sheer audacity of the people sitting around me. I did not scream. I did not cry. My chest felt tight, a familiar ache of being entirely unvalued by the people who shared my blood. But my mind immediately shifted into the cold, calculating gears of my profession. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days tracking offshore accounts, finding hidden assets, and exposing corporate fraud. Numbers did not lie to me, even when my family did. As my mother spoke about the goodness of their hearts, I mentally tallied the receipts. 2 years ago, that basement was a damp, mold-infested storage space with exposed wiring and a cracked foundation. My parents had been facing code violations from the city. I was living in a beautiful loft downtown, but my mother begged me to move back home to help them. I gave up my lease. I hired the contractors. I paid $50,000 of my own hard-earned money to eradicate the mold, lay down premium hardwood floors, upgrade the plumbing, and install a state-of-the-art kitchenette and smart home system. I turned their toxic hazard into a luxury suite. And I did not just live there for free. Every single month on the first day of the month, I transferred $3,000 into my father's checking account. They called it rent, but I knew exactly what it was. I had seen their tax returns. I had seen their bank statements. My father took early retirement 3 years ago because he wanted to play golf, and my mother spent her entire pension maintaining her status at the country club and buying lavish hats for church. My $3,000 was exactly the cost of their monthly mortgage and property tax. I was not leeching off them. I was the only structural pillar keeping this entire house out of foreclosure. "You want me to move out?" I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Yes," Charles said, crossing his arms. "It is non-negotiable. You have 30 days to get your things out. And leave the appliances. Those belong to the house." He was kicking me out on my birthday, seizing the $50,000 renovation I paid for, and handing it over to a white man who had not held a steady job in 2 years, all so Connor could pretend to be an entrepreneur. The absolute disrespect burned through my veins. But years of surviving their emotional abuse had taught me that reacting in anger only gave them the power to call me the angry, bitter black woman. I looked at Connor. His smug face was practically glowing with the thrill of displacing me. I looked at Jasmine, who was softly agreeing with my mother about how hard it was to raise a family in this economy. And finally, I looked at my parents, who were entirely willing to throw their eldest daughter to the wolves to maintain the illusion of their youngest daughter's perfect marriage. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I set the crystal glass down gently on the table. "Okay," I said. My mother blinked, clearly surprised by my lack of resistance. "Okay," she repeated. "Good. I am glad you are being mature about this, Imani. We knew you would understand." I stood up from the table. I smoothed down my skirt and picked up the 30-day notice, folding it neatly and placing it into my leather purse. "I will not need 30 days," I told them, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion they could use against me. "I will be out by tonight. Enjoy your dinner." I turned my back on them and walked toward the basement stairs. My heart was pounding not with grief, but with a terrifying, liberating clarity. The strong black woman cape they had draped over my shoulders my entire life was heavy, suffocating, and woven entirely from their lies. Tonight, I was taking it off. They wanted to play a game of real estate and finances. They had no idea they had just challenged the house, and the house always wins. I descended the wooden staircase I had personally sanded and stained 2 years ago. The moment my feet hit the plush carpet of the basement suite, the heavy tension of the dining room faded, replaced by the quiet hum of my state-of-the-art air purifier. This was my sanctuary. I had designed every square inch of it. The custom-built oak bookshelves, the sleek leather sectional, the imported marble countertops in the kitchenette. It was a space built for peace, and now it was the prize my family thought they had successfully stolen. I pulled my 3 hard-shell suitcases from the walk-in closet. I did not throw things. I did not cry. My mind was executing a tactical retreat. I began folding my designer clothes, neatly packing my shoes, and separating my work documents. I was about 20 minutes into packing when I heard the soft, deliberate footsteps coming down the stairs. Jasmine pushed the frosted glass door open, her face arranged into a mask of exaggerated sympathy. She leaned against the doorframe, letting out a heavy sigh that was meant to sound supportive, but carried the distinct pitch of a performance. "I am really sorry, Imani," Jasmine said, crossing her arms and pouting. "You know how Dad gets when he makes up his mind. He is just really stressed about money right now, and Connor and I are on the verge of something huge. We really need this space." I kept my back to her, carefully placing my silk blouses into a packing cube. "I know exactly how he gets, Jasmine," I replied evenly. She walked further into the room, her eyes immediately darting away from me and scanning the furniture. I watched her reflection in the full-length mirror. She was not down here to comfort me. She was taking inventory. "Wow," she murmured, running her hand over my ergonomic standing desk. "You really went all out down here. It is actually perfect for a tech headquarters. Connor was just saying he needed a professional setup for his investor Zoom calls." She paused, waiting for me to offer it to her. When I remained silent, she cleared her throat and pushed further. Actually, Imani, since you are moving out so suddenly, it would probably be a huge hassle for you to move all this heavy furniture, and Connor could really use those dual-curved monitors for his coding. You are just going to a small apartment anyway, right? It would be a huge help to the family if you just left the desk set up and the electronics here. Consider it an investment in our future. I turned around and looked at my younger sister. She was standing there in a dress our parents paid for, asking to keep thousands of dollars of my equipment for her unemployed white husband, all under the guise of family solidarity. I will be taking my monitors, Jasmine, I said, zipping the first suitcase closed. They are company property. And the desk comes with me. Jasmine frowned, dropping the sympathetic sister act entirely. Her posture stiffened. Honestly, Imani, this is exactly why Dad called you a burden upstairs. You are always so selfish. Connor is trying to build a business that will take care of all of us. You make a six-figure salary and you have no husband and no children to provide for. It is time you stop being selfish and start supporting Black wealth. The sheer irony of her statement almost made me laugh out loud. She was demanding I forfeit my hard-earned assets to a white man who had never held a job for more than 6 months, and she was wrapping it in the language of community empowerment. It was a manipulative tactic she had perfected since childhood. Whenever she wanted something of mine, she made me feel like I was betraying the family if I said no. Connor is not Black, Jasmine, I stated calmly, looking her right in the eyes. And his cryptocurrency hobby is not Black wealth. It is a gamble. If he wants a dual monitor set up for his startup, he can use the business loan he was just asking Dad to co-sign for. Jasmine gasped, her face flushing with anger. You are just bitter because he chose me, she snapped, entirely missing the point as usual. Just leave the Breville espresso machine then. Mom said you are legally required to leave the appliances anyway. While she stood there fuming over a coffee maker, my attention shifted to the small fireproof safe bolted beneath my desk. Let her have her tantrum over the espresso machine. Let her think she was winning the battle for the basement. I had my eyes on the actual war. I knelt down and entered the biometric code on the safe. The heavy metal door clicked open. Inside were a few passports and legal documents, but the only thing that mattered was a sleek matte black external hard drive. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards, but the data it held was heavy enough to sink my entire family. As a forensic accountant, I never did anything without leaving an audit trail. When I started paying my parents' mortgage disguised as rent 2 years ago, I demanded read-only access to their primary bank accounts to ensure the money was actually going to the bank. They had agreed, desperate for the cash. They had forgotten to revoke that access. This encrypted drive contained every bank statement, every hidden credit card balance, and every bounced check my parents had generated over the last 36 months. More importantly, it contained the digital breadcrumbs of Connor's financial activities. I knew exactly where his supposed startup capital was going, and it was not to tech investments. I slipped the hard drive into the hidden velvet-lined compartment of my leather work briefcase and locked the brass clasps. I felt a surge of absolute control. They could have the basement. They could have the espresso machine. They had no idea I was walking out the door with the keys to their entire financial existence. I am taking the espresso machine, Jasmine, I said, standing up with my briefcase firmly in hand. I bought it. It leaves when I leave. Jasmine let out a dramatic groan, stomping her foot like a toddler. You are unbelievable, Imani. Dad is going to hear about this. She spun on her heel and marched back up the stairs, eager to play the victim and report my lack of cooperation to our parents. I let her go. I finished packing the last of my shoes, zipped the final suitcase, and rolled them toward the door. I took one last look at the beautiful suite I had built. I pulled out my phone and disabled the smart lights, plunging the room into darkness. They wanted me gone tonight, so I was leaving. But I was not leaving as a victim. I was leaving as their auditor. I rolled my suitcases up the stairs one by one. The house was quiet now, the earlier tension replaced by a thick, awkward silence. My father was sitting in his leather recliner staring at the television without actually watching it. Jasmine and Connor were nowhere to be seen, likely already measuring the basement for their imaginary startup. My mother was waiting for me in the kitchen. She had poured herself a glass of wine and was leaning against the granite counter looking perfectly composed. I walked over and placed my silver house key on the marble island. The metallic clink sounded incredibly loud in the quiet kitchen. It was the sound of a chain finally snapping. My mother picked up the key, her manicured nails tapping against the metal. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind she used during church testimony service. "I know this feels sudden, Imani," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal sorrow. "But truly, this is for the best. It is a season of transition for our family. You have been so strong and we appreciate everything you did down there. But Jasmine needs her village right now. When you have your own husband and children one day, you will understand the sacrifices a mother has to make to ensure her family succeeds. We are praying for your next chapter." She reached out to hug me, a hollow performative gesture. I stepped back just enough to avoid her grasp. I did not give her the satisfaction of my tears, nor did I offer the angry outburst she was hoping for so she could play the victim. "Keep the espresso machine clean," I said evenly. "The warranty expires in 3 months." I turned and walked out the front door, leaving her standing there with her arms half raised. I loaded my bags into the trunk of my car, got into the driver's seat and drove away from the manicured lawns and the suffocating expectations of my childhood neighborhood. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. My parents assumed I was heading to a cheap motel off the highway, or maybe to crash on a friend's couch. They thought kicking me out was a punishment that would leave me desperate and humiliated. They had absolutely no idea that for the past 2 years I had been living a double life. While they were busy funding Jasmine and Connor and draining their own retirement to keep up appearances, I had been quietly thriving. I am a senior forensic accountant. My bonuses alone were more than my father made in a year. 2 years ago, when I realized my parents would never see me as anything more than a financial safety net, I made a silent investment in my own future. I drove straight downtown, pulling up to a sleek, modern glass high-rise building overlooking the city skyline. The valet greeted me by name. I drove down into the private, secure underground parking garage and parked in my deeded spot. I owned a $2 million penthouse condo on the 34th floor. It was a space I had bought entirely in cash, a sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling windows, custom artwork, and absolute peace. I never told my family about it. I knew if my parents saw the marble bathrooms and the panoramic views, they would immediately demand I pay off their mortgage, or worse, expect me to move Jasmine and Connor into the guest suite. This was my soft life, completely insulated from their toxic chaos. I turned off the engine and took a deep breath, letting the leather seat support me. For the first time in 35 years, I was completely unburdened. I did not owe them a dime. I did not owe them my presence. Just as I reached for the door handle, the quiet cabin of my car was pierced by the sharp buzz of my phone. I pulled it out of my purse and glanced at the screen. It was an automated security alert from the national bank where my parents held their accounts. Because I used to manage their taxes and had set up their online banking years ago, I still had administrative monitoring access. It was a fail-safe I kept active just in case my parents ever became victims of a scam. I opened the secure app, my eyes scanning the bold red notification. Someone was attempting a wire transfer. The amount was $10,000. It was being pulled directly from Charles and Brenda's emergency savings, the very last account keeping them from total financial ruin. I checked the destination routing number and the authorized signature attached to the digital request. It was not my father. The initiator was Connor, my white, unemployed brother-in-law who had just spent the evening gloating about my eviction, was actively draining my parents' life savings while they were upstairs celebrating my departure. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. My family thought they had won the war by taking my basement. They did not realize they had just handed the keys to their entire financial survival over to a thief, while the only accountant who could save them was sitting in a penthouse watching the entire ship go down. A full 7 days passed. There were no apologies from my parents. There were no text messages asking if I had found a safe place to sleep or if I had enough money to eat. Just absolute profound silence from the people who shared my blood. For the first 35 years of my life, that kind of rejection would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety, desperately trying to figure out how to win their love back. But sitting in my penthouse looking out over the city skyline, I realized their silence was not a punishment. It was a vacation. I spent the week leaning completely into my soft life. I woke up to the natural light filtering through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I made myself gourmet breakfasts, using the espresso machine Jasmine had tried to steal. I worked remotely from my marble kitchen island, closing massive audit files for my corporate clients while wearing silk pajamas. For the first time, my energy belonged entirely to me. I was not managing my parents' financial anxieties, and I was not shielding my sister from the consequences of her choices. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the peace was finally broken. My phone screen lit up, vibrating against the marble countertop. The caller ID displayed Jasmine's name. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Imani finally. Jasmine sighed into the receiver. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing after being evicted on my birthday. Her voice carried the sharp, impatient tone of someone who was accustomed to being accommodated immediately. Listen, I need the master admin password for the basement smart home hub. Connor is trying to host a virtual pitch meeting with some major investors, and it is freezing down here. You locked the thermostat at 65 degrees before you left, and the security cameras keep beeping because they are trying to connect to your phone. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request left me momentarily speechless. She had stood by while our parents threw me out of the home I was paying for, demanded I leave my expensive electronics behind for her unemployed husband, and was now casually calling to ask for IT support. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Jasmine, I said, my voice perfectly level. The smart home system is registered under my personal email and tied to my private network. I am not giving you the admin password. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Imani, do not do this right now. We do not have time for your petty games. Connor needs the temperature raised, and he wants to use the integrated camera system for his Zoom call. Just text me the password. There is no game, I replied smoothly. The hardware belongs to the house, but the network belongs to me. If Connor wants a smart home, he can drive down to the electronics store, buy his own central hub, and install it himself. Jasmine let out a theatrical groan, the exact sound she used to make when we were teenagers, and she wanted our mother to come scold me. This is exactly why nobody wants to deal with you, Imani. You are always so difficult. You are literally hoarding a password just to punish us because you are bitter about the living situation. Bitter. The word hung in the air, incredibly ironic, considering I was currently looking out at a multi-million-dollar view while she was shivering in a basement. I am not bitter, Jasmine. I am just no longer responsible for your comfort. Well, you sound bitter. Jasmine snapped, her voice rising in pitch as she launched into her favorite defensive tactic. You have been acting jealous of me since the day Connor and I got married. You cannot stand the fact that I have a happy marriage and a man who actually takes care of me. You are just mad because you do not have a provider and you have to work yourself to the bone while my husband is building an empire for our family. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my plush velvet bar stool. An empire. That was certainly a creative way to describe stealing from our parents' retirement fund. Connor's tech business is booming. Imani Jasmine continued, completely unaware of the trap she was walking into. He is finalizing a massive round of funding this week. We are talking 6 figures. Once this deal closes, we are moving out of the basement and buying a mansion in the suburbs. So keep your stupid thermostat password. We will not even need it soon. We are doing better than ever. Booming. Doing better than ever. I listened to her brag, my mind instantly flashing back to the security alert I had received 7 days ago. The desperate failed digital attempt to siphon $10,000 from our parents' emergency savings account. The bank had flagged the transaction and temporarily frozen the account pending verification. I knew for a fact Connor had been spending the entire week sweating, unable to access the stolen funds he desperately needed to cover whatever massive debts he was hiding. If begging your in-laws' bank for an unauthorized withdrawal was his idea of booming, I would hate to see his definition of bankruptcy. Jasmine was living in an absolute delusion, entirely funded by the stolen equity of our parents' home and the lies of a mediocre white man who used her as a human shield. She wanted to hurt me by rubbing his imaginary success in my face. She wanted to trigger the angry black woman reaction so she could hang up and tell Connor how unhinged I was. Instead, I gave her nothing but cold corporate efficiency. "I am really glad to hear business is booming, Jasmine," I said, my tone dripping with absolute calm. "Since Connor is closing such massive deals this week, he will not mind that I am remotely initiating a factory reset on the basement hub right now. The thermostat will revert to manual control. The cameras will shut down. You will have to walk over to the wall and flip the switches yourselves like everyone else." "Wait, what? No, Imani. Do not you dare shut it down." Jasmine panicked, the arrogant tone instantly vanishing. "Have a great pitch meeting," I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear, opened the smart home app on my tablet and tapped the red icon to factory wipe the system. I heard Jasmine screaming my name through the phone speaker just before I pressed end call. I blocked her number immediately. I set my phone face down on the marble counter, took a deep breath, and smiled. The financial storm was brewing over their heads, and they were too busy fighting over a thermostat to look up at the sky. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. 2 days after the smart home wipe, my phone chimed with a text message from my father. It was not an apology, nor was it an inquiry into my well-being. It was a directive. "Family meeting at Capital Prime Steakhouse downtown, 7 o'clock tonight. Be there." I stared at the screen, letting out a soft laugh. Capital Prime was one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in the city. A single ribeye cost almost $100. My parents were currently operating on maxed-out credit cards and bouncing checks, yet my father was still trying to maintain the facade of a wealthy patriarch commanding his family. I knew exactly what this was. It was an ambush. I could have ignored the text, but ignoring them would imply I was hiding, and I had absolutely nothing to hide. I decided to attend, but I was going to do it on my terms. I spent 2 hours getting ready. I slipped into a tailored emerald green designer dress that hugged my curves perfectly. I wore my favorite gold statement jewelry and a pair of red bottom heels that clicked with absolute authority. My hair was styled in flawless silk-pressed waves. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see the discarded, burdened daughter they tried to leave in the basement. I saw a senior forensic accountant who held all the cards. I arrived at the restaurant exactly at 7. The maitre d' led me through the dimly lit mahogany-paneled dining room. I spotted them in a leather booth near the back. My father Charles was wearing his best Sunday suit. My mother Brenda had on her pearls and a stiff smile. And sitting across from them, looking entirely out of place in a wrinkled button-down shirt, was Connor. Jasmine was notably absent, probably playing the role of the stressed mother back at the house to add to the manipulation tactic. When I approached the table, the conversation immediately stopped. My mother looked me up and down, her eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and instant disapproval. She hated when I looked successful without her permission. "You are late," my father said, though the clock on the wall clearly read 7 exactly. "Have a seat." I slid into the plush leather booth opposite Connor. The table was already crowded with expensive appetizers, shrimp cocktail, Wagyu beef sliders, and 3 glasses of premium scotch. They were running up a tab they assumed I would eventually pay. "You look very flashy, Imani," my mother said, her tone laced with that familiar passive-aggressive venom. "We are here to discuss serious family business, not attend a fashion show." I picked up the linen napkin, ignoring her jab, and placed it on my lap. "I am here, Charles," I said, addressing my father directly by his first name. That alone made his jaw clench. "What is the business?" My father cleared his throat, trying to regain his position of authority. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it and slid a stack of stapled papers across the pristine white tablecloth. The document stopped right in front of my plate. I glanced down. It was a commercial business loan application from a mid-tier lending firm. The requested amount was $100,000. The primary borrower was listed as Connor, and right there on the bottom of the second page was a line for a guarantor. My name was already neatly typed beneath the blank signature line. Connor is on the verge of a massive breakthrough with his tech startup. My father began using his deep, authoritative voice. He has the vision and the drive, but because all his current capital is tied up in high-yield cryptocurrency investments, his liquid credit is temporarily frozen. The bank just needs a co-signer to release the funds. I stared at the paperwork. The sheer delusion was almost suffocating. "He just needs a signature," Connor chimed in, leaning forward with a smarmy, entitled smile. "With your corporate salary and credit score, they will approve it instantly. You will not even have to pay a dime, Imani. I will cover the monthly installments. It is just a formality so I can scale the business." I looked from Connor to my father, and then to my mother. "You invited me to a five-star steakhouse less than 2 weeks after throwing me out of my home on my birthday to ask me to co-sign a $100,000 loan for a man who does not even have a job. It is an investment in our family legacy," my father snapped, slamming his hand lightly on the table. "You have the means, Imani. God has blessed you with a good career. It is time you use those blessings to elevate your sister and her husband." My mother leaned in, resting her arms on the table. This was her favorite part, the emotional manipulation. She lowered her voice, trying to sound like a loving, concerned matriarch. "Be reasonable, Imani. Look at your life. You are 35 years old. You are unmarried. You have no children. What exactly are you spending your money on? Designer dresses and shoes. Jasmine is raising a family. She is building a home. You do not have the financial responsibilities that she has. It is your familial duty to help them get on their feet. When you finally settle down, if that ever happens, we will be there for you too. But right now, Jasmine needs this." The words were designed to cut me down to size. They were designed to make me feel inadequate, to remind me that in their eyes a black woman's worth was only tied to her ability to produce children and serve a man. My success, my education, my career, none of it mattered to them unless it could be liquidated to fund Jasmine's life. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I slowly pushed the loan application back across the table until it touched my father's water glass. "No," I said. The single word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "Excuse me?" My father growled, his face reddening. "I said no." I repeated, keeping my voice calm and perfectly modulated. "I will not co-sign this loan. I will not put my name, my credit, or my hard-earned money on the line for Connor's imaginary startup." Connor scoffed, throwing his hands up in exaggerated frustration. "Imaginary. Just because you do not understand blockchain technology does not mean it is not a viable business model, Imani. You are just being spiteful because Jasmine asked for the basement." I turned my gaze to Connor. "You do not have a business model, Connor. You have a gambling addiction wrapped in tech buzzwords. You want my signature because no reputable bank on earth would hand $100,000 to a man whose credit is decimated. Your liquid assets are not tied up in crypto. They do not exist." Connor's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "And as for my familial duty," I said, looking back at my mother, "my duty was fulfilled when I spent $50,000 making that basement livable. My duty was fulfilled when I handed over $3,000 a month just so you two could pretend you were not drowning in debt. My money is my own. I am not funding a lifestyle that none of you can afford." My father was furious now. He leaned across the table, pointing a thick finger at my face. "You ungrateful, selfish girl. We gave you everything. We raised you. If you do not pick up that pen and sign this document, you are going to regret it. You are going to walk out of here with no family left." I looked at the pen resting on top of the folder. They really thought fear would work. They thought the threat of being cast out of this toxic circle would break me. They had no idea I had already closed the door behind me, and I was holding the only key. I watched the vein in my father's forehead pulse. He leaned across the table, his face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. The mahogany walls of the expensive steakhouse seemed to absorb the heavy silence that fell over our booth. He was not used to being told no. For 3 decades, his word had been absolute law in our household. He governed our family with a rigid, authoritarian hand, constantly using the Bible and his position as head deacon at Mount Zion Baptist Church as weapons to enforce compliance. "Do you have any idea what you are doing, Imani?" My father hissed, his voice a low and dangerous rumble that carried across the white tablecloth. "If you walk out of here without signing that paper, I will make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. I will stand before the congregation this Sunday. I will tell Pastor Davis, the elder board, and every single family we have known for 20 years that my eldest daughter has turned her back on her own flesh and blood. You will be a pariah. The entire community will know you abandoned us. You will be a complete disgrace to the family name." My mother sat perfectly still next to him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not try to calm him down. She simply watched me with cold, calculating eyes, waiting for the immense social pressure of the Black church community to break my spirit. In our circle, your reputation at church was everything. To be publicly shamed from the pulpit was the ultimate excommunication. They truly believed that the threat of losing my community would force me to pick up the pen and sign away $100,000. Sitting across from me, Connor took a slow sip of his imported scotch. He adjusted the cuffs of his wrinkled shirt and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. He was thoroughly enjoying the show. He loved watching Black family dynamics implode, especially when it benefited him. "Listen to your father," Imani Connor said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "You really do not want to blow up your whole life and humiliate your parents over a simple signature. It is just a piece of paper. I am going to make the payments anyway. Do not be so dramatic. Just sign the document and we can all go back to enjoying this beautiful dinner." I looked at Connor. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from his mediocre existence. He had stolen from my parents, forged signatures, and was actively driving them into foreclosure. Yet he sat there acting like the voice of reason. He felt completely protected by the shield of my parents' desperate need to maintain their image. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my character. I simply raised my right hand and caught the attention of our waiter, a young man who had been nervously hovering near the wine station, clearly aware of the tension radiating from our booth. The waiter hurried over holding a sleek black leather checkbook. "Will there be anything else for the table this evening?" he asked, his eyes darting between my furious father and my perfectly calm face. "No," I said smoothly. "We are finished here. I will take the check." My father scoffed, leaning back against the leather booth. "Go ahead and let her pay for it," he told my mother, crossing his arms over his chest. "If she is going to act like she is too good to help her own family, she can foot the bill for wasting our time." The waiter placed the black leather booklet on the table in front of me. I opened it. The total was over $800. They had ordered Wagyu beef sliders, massive ribeye steaks, truffle macaroni and cheese, and multiple rounds of top-shelf liquor. They had ordered like royalty, assuming they could either guilt me into paying or add it to their mountain of hidden, suffocating credit card debt. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my wallet. I did not pull out a standard bank card. I did not pull out the corporate credit card my parents assumed I relied on. I reached into the back slot and pulled out my American Express Centurion card. It was heavy. It was made of solid, anodized titanium. It was not a card you could just apply for. It was an invitation-only card reserved exclusively for individuals who spent and paid off hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of massive liquid wealth. I dropped the heavy black metal card onto the silver tray. It landed with a loud, sharp clink that echoed over the soft jazz music playing in the background. The sound made Connor look down. His eyes landed on the card, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly. The smug smile vanished from his face. As someone who spent all day pretending to be a wealthy crypto investor, Connor knew exactly what a Centurion card was. He knew the initiation fee alone was $10,000. He knew the annual spending requirements. He knew that holding that card meant I possessed a level of financial power he could not even begin to comprehend. Is that Connor started to speak? His voice suddenly tight and breathless. His face turned completely pale as he stared at the black titanium rectangle resting on the tray. I did not look at him. I handed the tray to the waiter. "Put the entire balance on this," I instructed. "And please add a 30% gratuity for yourself. Thank you for your excellent service tonight." The waiter nodded respectfully and hurried away to process the transaction. My mother frowned, confused by Connor's sudden panic. "What is the matter, Connor?" she asked, looking back and forth between him and the spot where the card had just been. Connor could not even formulate a sentence. He just kept staring at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden terrifying realization. He was finally understanding that the woman he had just told to go rent a little apartment was standing on an absolute mountain of wealth. He was realizing that I did not refuse to co-sign his loan because I was petty. I refused because I was completely out of his league. I picked up the manila folder containing the loan application. I calmly tore the document exactly in half, right down the middle, and placed the torn pieces on top of Connor's empty dinner plate. My father was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "You think you are so smart, Amani?" He seethed, completely unaware of the financial revelation that had just paralyzed his son-in-law. "You think money makes you better than us. I will destroy your reputation. I will make sure the whole church knows what a selfish, heartless daughter you are." The waiter returned a moment later, handing me the receipt to sign. I uncapped my pen, left a generous tip, and signed my name with smooth, elegant strokes. I placed the titanium card back into my wallet and picked up my purse. I slid out of the booth and stood up to my full height. I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald dress, looking down at the three of them. They looked incredibly small sitting there in the dim lighting of the restaurant. The illusion of their power over me was completely broken. I looked directly into my father's angry eyes. "Go ahead and tell Pastor Davis whatever you want," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable confidence. "Stand at the pulpit and cry. Tell the entire congregation I am a disgrace. Tell them I walked away. Just make sure you can afford to pay your tithes when the collection plate comes around." I turned on my heel and walked away. The sharp, authoritative click of my red bottom heels echoed through the dining room as I made my way toward the exit. I did not look back. I stepped out into the cool evening air, handed my valet ticket to the attendant, and waited for my luxury car to be brought around. I had just declared war on their entire reality. And the best part was, I had the receipts to burn their fake empire to the ground. The drive back to my penthouse was incredibly peaceful. The city lights blurred past my windows, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension I had just left behind in that mahogany-paneled steakhouse. I handed my keys to the overnight valet attendant, rode the private elevator up to the 34th floor, and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my home. I did not feel guilty. I did not feel sad. I felt the absolute razor-sharp clarity of a woman who had finally stopped playing a rigged game. I kicked off my red bottom heels, leaving them neatly by the door. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and headed straight down the hallway to my home office. This was where I did my real work. My corporate firm paid me a massive salary to track missing millions for Fortune 500 companies, but tonight I was taking on a pro bono case. Tonight I was auditing my own family. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and pressed the power button on my custom-built workstation. Three massive curved monitors hummed to life, illuminating the dark room with a cool blue glow. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the matte black external hard drive I had rescued from the basement safe on the night they kicked me out. I plugged it into the secure port on my tower and typed in my 32-character decryption password. The drive mounted, displaying dozens of neatly organized folders. This was the financial heartbeat of my parents' entire existence. I opened the master ledger, a comprehensive spreadsheet I had started 3 years ago when I first took over their tax preparation. But I did not just want historical data. I needed the real-time numbers. Using the administrative access I still possessed, I securely logged into my parents' primary banking portal. The dashboard loaded, and the reality of their situation immediately painted a grim picture. Their joint checking account was overdrawn by $400. Their emergency savings, the one Connor had tried to tap into a week ago, was completely frozen. But those were just the surface accounts. I needed to see the deep reserves. I clicked over to my father's retirement portfolio. For 30 years, Charles had worked a stable corporate management job. He was incredibly proud of his $450,000 401k plan. He used to brag about it at church barbecues, positioning himself as a man of great financial wisdom. When the page refreshed, I actually gasped. The balance was completely decimated. It sat at a pathetic $12,000. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the transaction history. My father had been making massive early withdrawals, happily paying the astronomical tax penalties just to liquidate the cash. There was a wire transfer for $50,000 in March, another for $30,000 in June, a massive pull of $80,000 in September. Every single withdrawal was followed immediately by an outbound wire transfer. I clicked on the destination details for the outgoing wires. Every single penny had been sent to a commercial checking account registered to an entity called Apex Digital Innovations, LLC. This was Connor's supposed tech startup, the empire Jasmine claimed he was building. The business my parents were happily sacrificing their golden years to fund, while they looked me in the eye and called me a financial burden. I opened a new tab and pulled up the Delaware Division of Corporations database. Fraudsters and fake entrepreneurs loved registering their shell companies in Delaware because of the corporate privacy laws, but as a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how to pierce the corporate veil. I ran a search for Apex Digital Innovations. The registration documents populated on my screen. Connor was listed as the sole managing member. I cross-referenced the business address. It was not a sleek downtown office building or a collaborative tech incubator. It was a rented mailbox inside a retail shipping store situated in a strip mall 2 towns over. I dug deeper, pulling the state tax filings and employment records. Apex Digital Innovations had absolutely no business license in our home state. They had never filed a single payroll tax return. They had 0 registered employees. There was no proprietary software, no patent applications, no server hosting fees. There was absolutely no product. The startup was a ghost. It was nothing but a hollow shell designed to catch the money falling from my parents' retirement accounts. But the money did not stay in the LLC checking account. A shell company is just a funnel. I needed to see where the water was flowing. I utilized a specialized software tool my firm used for tracing digital assets. I input the routing data from Connor's business account. The pattern was immediate and incredibly aggressive. The moment my father wired $40,000 or $50,000 into the Apex account, Connor would execute a series of smaller, staggered transfers to a popular mainstream cryptocurrency exchange. This was where Connor thought he was being clever. He assumed that once the money was converted into Bitcoin or Ethereum, it became invisible to traditional banking audits. He probably told my father that crypto was the future of tech investing, baffling an older black man with buzzwords like blockchain and decentralized finance until my father handed over his life savings just to feel like he was part of the wealthy elite. But the blockchain is a public ledger. It is the exact opposite of invisible if you know how to read it. I extracted the wallet addresses associated with Connor's exchange account and ran them through my tracing program. The digital coins did not sit in an investment portfolio gaining value. They did not fund a tech platform. They were immediately pushed out of the exchange and bounced through a series of digital tumblers, a weak attempt to wash the money and hide the final destination. I followed the digital trail right across international borders. The receiving wallets were massive, high-volume accounts, hosted on servers in Costa Rica, Curaçao, and Malta. I stared at the IP addresses, a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. I knew exactly what those servers were. They were offshore, unregulated sportsbooks and high-stakes online casinos. Connor was not an entrepreneur. He was not a tech visionary. He was a catastrophic gambling addict. I remembered all the Sunday afternoons Charles would stand at the front of the church sanctuary, holding his Bible, lecturing the young men in the congregation about the importance of financial stewardship. He preached about building a solid foundation, about avoiding the traps of quick money. Yet behind closed doors, his own internalized prejudices and desperate need to be adjacent to what he perceived as white success had blinded him completely. He allowed Connor to bypass every single boundary he would have strictly enforced on anyone else. He gave Connor a level of blind trust he had never, not even for a single second, extended to me. I watched the transaction logs scroll down my screen. It was a digital hemorrhage. It was not just the big transfers either. I found dozens of smaller, sporadic charges on my parents' remaining credit cards. Cash advances taken out at 2 in the morning. International transaction fees linked to online gaming portals. Connor had bled them out slowly at first, and then when the addiction took complete control, he had taken a machete to their life savings. He was taking the generational wealth my parents had worked 3 decades to build, converting it to digital currency, and blowing it on offshore blackjack hands and international sports parlays. He had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in a matter of months. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me. My parents had looked at me, their educated, successful, hard-working black daughter, and saw nothing but a resource to be exploited and discarded. They had kicked me out of the home I was paying for, completely convinced that their white son-in-law was going to elevate their social status. They had bought into his confident, mediocre charms so completely that they handed him the keys to their entire financial future without ever asking to see a single spreadsheet or business plan. And Jasmine. Jasmine stood in my basement demanding I leave my expensive computer monitors behind so her husband could build black wealth. She was either the most gullible woman on the planet, or she was entirely complicit in the destruction of our parents' lives. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my face. The pieces of the puzzle had completely locked together. Connor was desperate for that $100,000 business loan at the steakhouse because he had completely tapped my parents dry and he owed money to people who did not care about his excuses. He needed my pristine credit score to fund his next desperate bet to win it all back. My parents were completely broke. Their retirement was gone. Their savings were frozen. The only thing they had left to their name was the equity sitting in the house they had just kicked me out of. My eyes narrowed. The house. If Connor was willing to drain their retirement accounts and attempt unauthorized wire transfers from their emergency fund, there was absolutely no way he had left the equity in that house untouched. A gambler that deep in the hole always goes for the biggest pile of cash available. I leaned forward, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I needed to look at the county property records. I needed to see exactly what Connor had done to the deed of my childhood home. I opened a new secure browser window and navigated to the Municipal Property Records portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard entering the parcel identification number for my childhood home. The search wheel spun for a few seconds before generating a chronological list of every legal document attached to the property. I scrolled past the original warranty deed from the late 90s and the standard refinancing documents from a decade ago. Everything looked perfectly normal until my eyes hit a newly registered filing dated exactly 14 months ago. It was a deed of trust securing a massive promissory note. A second mortgage. My heart rate remained steady, but my eyes narrowed as I clicked to open the digitized public document. When the PDF loaded, I scanned the terms and the lender information. It was not a traditional bank or a reputable credit union. The lien holder was a company called Apex Alternative Lending, a notorious hard money private equity firm known for issuing high-interest predatory loans to desperate borrowers who could not qualify for standard financing. The loan amount was $250,000. My father was a proud, image-obsessed man. He would never walk into a predatory lending office and subject himself to double-digit interest rates. It went against everything he preached. I scrolled down to the final page of the document to inspect the authorization. There on the bottom line was my father's name. But the moment I looked at the digital scan of the ink, I knew immediately it was a fraud. As a forensic accountant who had prepared Charles and Brenda's taxes for years, I knew my father's signature better than I knew my own. Charles signed his name with a sharp, aggressive slant, heavily pressing the pen into the paper on the first letter of his last name. The signature on this mortgage document was rounded, hesitant, and entirely too neat. It looked like someone had traced it off an old utility bill. It was Connor. Connor had forged my father's signature to take out $250,000 in equity against my parents' house, funneling the money directly into his offshore gambling accounts. He likely used Jasmine to intercept the mailed documents or secretly accessed my father's digital identity to bypass the verification protocols. But the nightmare did not stop at the forgery. I refreshed the county clerk dashboard and checked the current status of the lien. A bright red flag populated on the screen. A notice of default had been officially recorded against the property 3 days ago. The predatory loan was 60 days delinquent. The grace period was completely exhausted. Connor had stopped making the monthly payments because he had gambled away all the stolen capital and drained the rest of my parents' liquid cash. The private lending firm was officially initiating pre-foreclosure proceedings. My parents were sleeping in their custom king-sized bed, completely unaware that their house was literally weeks away from being auctioned off on the courthouse steps. I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction washing over me. Connor had not just stolen their money, he had stolen the roof over their heads. Suddenly, the quiet hum of my office was shattered by the aggressive, rapid-fire buzzing of my phone. I picked it up from the desk. My screen was entirely filled with incoming text messages, but they were not from my parents. They were from my extended family. The flying monkeys had officially been deployed. I opened the first message. It was from my Aunt Patricia, my mother's oldest sister, a woman who treated church gossip like an Olympic sport. "I cannot believe you, Imani," her text read. "Your mother is inconsolable. After everything they did for you, letting you live in their house as a grown woman, you steal from them. You need to return that money immediately and beg God for forgiveness." I frowned, swiping back to the main screen. There were messages from my Uncle Vernon, 2 of my older cousins, and even a distant godmother. They all echoed the exact same vitriol. "You are dead to this family," Uncle Vernon wrote, "biting the hand that feeds you. Do not ever show your face at the family reunion again." I took a deep breath, piecing together exactly what had happened while I was driving home from the steakhouse. My mother had gone into full damage control. When I threw down my titanium black card and refused to fund Connor's imaginary startup, Brenda realized she could no longer control me. In a narcissistic family dynamic, when they can no longer control you, they immediately pivot to controlling how other people see you. Brenda had picked up her phone the moment I walked out of the restaurant and initiated a massive smear campaign. But she could not tell the family that I refused to co-sign a loan, because that would expose the fact that Connor was broke. She needed a narrative that made me the villain and protected the golden child's husband. So she lied. She told the entire extended family that the reason they kicked me out of the basement was because they caught me stealing. She completely twisted the reality of the $10,000 wire transfer that the bank had frozen. She told everyone that I had hacked into their emergency savings, tried to steal $10,000, and ran away to live a flashy, sinful lifestyle downtown. She turned me into a thief to cover for the actual criminals sitting at her dinner table. My phone buzzed again. Another cousin telling me I was a disgrace to black women everywhere. For a brief fleeting second, the old version of me wanted to react. The daughter who spent 35 years begging for scraps of validation wanted to take screenshots of the offshore gambling accounts, the forged mortgage, and the zero-balance retirement funds. I wanted to blast them all into the family group chat and scream my innocence. But I looked at the forensic evidence shining on my monitors, and that desperate urge vanished instantly. You cannot outcommunicate a committed misunderstanding. My extended family did not want the truth. They wanted a scapegoat. They wanted to believe I was the problem because it was easier than confronting the reality that the picture-perfect patriarch and matriarch of our family were entirely hollow. I did not reply to a single text message. I opened my phone settings and systematically blocked Aunt Patricia, Uncle Vernon, my cousins, and every other relative who had sent a message. I silenced the noise. Exposing Connor to the family group chat would just create a messy, emotional argument. My parents would instantly go into denial. Brenda would claim I fabricated the banking documents out of spite. Charles would refuse to believe a white man had outsmarted him. They would protect Connor to protect their own pride. I did not need to win an argument in a text thread. I needed to own the entire board. I turned my attention back to the massive monitor displaying the notice of default from Apex Alternative Lending. The predatory firm was demanding immediate payment in full to halt the foreclosure. They did not care who paid the debt, they only cared about recovering their capital. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. Connor thought he was playing Monopoly with my parents' lives. He thought he could leverage their house, lose the money, and face zero consequences because Charles and Brenda would always cover for him. But the bank was calling the loan, and I had more liquid capital than the bank. I opened a secure encrypted email portal and began drafting a message to my corporate attorney. I was not going to tell my parents they were losing their house. I was going to buy the debt myself. I typed out a secure email to my corporate attorney, Julian. He was a brilliant, ruthless bulldog of a lawyer who handled my real estate portfolio and private contracts. I did not give him the emotional backstory. I gave him a directive. I told him I needed to immediately register an anonymous shell company in Delaware, and I needed him to broker the purchase of a distressed second mortgage from a predatory lending firm called Apex Alternative Lending. Julian called me less than 10 minutes after I hit send. Imani. He said, his voice completely professional, but laced with mild curiosity. I see the property address. Is this not your parents' residence? Yes, I replied, staring at the digital notice of default on my monitor. The note is 60 days delinquent. The primary borrower forged the authorization signature and the lender is actively initiating foreclosure. I want to buy the paper. Julian paused for a moment, his legal mind quickly calculating the implications. If you just want to save the house, you can simply pay off the arrears to bring the account current. You do not need to buy the entire debt. I do not want to save the house, Julian. I stated, my voice as cold as absolute zero. If I pay off the arrears, the person who forged the signature gets away with it and my parents will just let him leverage the house again. I want to own the debt. I want to become the primary lien holder. I heard the subtle click of Julian typing on his keyboard. Understood, he said. A hostile takeover of the family estate. I will have the LLC registered by tomorrow morning. We will call it Obsidian Equity Partners. I will contact Apex Alternative Lending immediately after. Since the debt is non-performing and heading into a messy legal foreclosure, they will be thrilled to offload it for cash. Get your funds ready. I hung up the phone and opened my private investment portfolio. $250,000 was a massive amount of money. For my parents, it was a life-destroying debt. For Connor, it was a mountain of stolen capital thrown into the void of an offshore casino. But for me, it was simply a strategic reallocation of liquid assets. I authorized the liquidation of $250,000 from my high-yield money market account, moving it directly into the escrow account Julian had established. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. I was not buying my parents' love. I was buying absolute undeniable leverage. The process moved with terrifying speed. Hard money lenders like Apex Alternative Lending are not traditional banks. They do not care about customer service or community relations. They operate purely on profit and risk mitigation. When Julian approached them the following afternoon, representing an anonymous corporate buyer willing to pay the full principal balance in cash to acquire a toxic defaulting asset, they did not ask questions. They drafted the assignment of the deed of trust within hours. For 3 days, I worked from my penthouse sipping matcha lattes and auditing corporate accounts, while Julian handled the legal warfare in the background. My parents remained completely silent, assuming their smear campaign had successfully isolated me. They thought I was sitting in some cheap apartment drowning in guilt and shame, completely destroyed by the loss of my family. On Friday morning, my phone chimed with a secure encrypted file transfer from Julian. The subject line simply read, "Transaction complete." I opened the attached PDF. It was a fully executed, legally binding assignment of deed of trust. Apex Alternative Lending had officially transferred the promissory note and the mortgage lien to Obsidian Equity Partners. The document had already been electronically filed and recorded with the county clerk's office. I sat back in my chair and stared at the digital signatures. The sheer gravity of what I had just accomplished settled over me. I had completely flipped the power dynamic of my entire bloodline. My parents had kicked me out of their basement on my birthday, treating me like a worthless squatter. They had demanded I leave my belongings behind. They had allowed my unemployed brother-in-law to mock my single status and my career. They had threatened to ruin my reputation in our community if I did not finance their delusions. And now legally and undeniably, I owned the roof over their heads. I was no longer just their daughter. I was the bank. If they missed a single payment, which I knew for a fact they would, I had the absolute legal authority to evict them, seize the property, and throw their entire fake empire into the street. The irony was so exquisite, I could taste it. I picked up my phone, planning to pour myself a glass of expensive champagne to celebrate my new real estate acquisition. But before my thumb could unlock the screen, a new notification pushed its way through my banners. It was not a text message from a flying monkey aunt or a demanding email from my father. It was an alert from TikTok. My best friend Maya had sent me a direct link to a video with an urgent capitalized message attached. "You need to see this right now. She is going viral." I felt a sudden sharp prickle of irritation. I tapped the link and the TikTok app immediately launched on my phone. The screen filled with my sister Jasmine's face. She was sitting in the newly renovated basement suite, the exact space I had paid $50,000 to rebuild. The lighting was perfectly adjusted to make her look pale, exhausted, and deeply traumatized. She was wearing no makeup, a strategic choice designed to weaponize her tears. And she was crying. Real, heavy theatrical tears streaming down her face. The video title was superimposed over her forehead in bold white text. "How My Sister Destroyed Our Black Family." I pressed play, the volume filling the quiet space of my office. "Hey guys," Jasmine started, her voice trembling perfectly. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this. But my family is completely broken, and I just need a safe space to talk about financial abuse." She paused to wipe a tear from her cheek, staring soulfully into the camera. "A lot of you know, we have been trying to get a tech startup off the ground to build generational wealth for our community. What you do not know is that my older sister, who makes a massive corporate salary, has been secretly draining my elderly parents' savings accounts. She hacked into their emergency fund last week and tried to steal $10,000. When my father confronted her, she laughed in his face, packed her designer bags, and abandoned them. My jaw locked tightly as I watched her spin an absolute pure fiction. She was taking every single crime Connor had committed and neatly pinning it onto my chest. Now my parents are struggling to buy groceries. Jasmine sobbed, looking incredibly tragic. She left us with massive utility bills, and she is out there living her best life downtown, refusing to even speak to the people who raised her. It just hurts so much to see someone you love turn their back on their own village just because they got a little bit of money. Black women are supposed to protect each other, but she destroyed us. Please be careful who you trust, even if it is your own blood. I checked the engagement metrics at the bottom of the screen. The video had been posted 4 hours ago. It already had 200,000 views, 40,000 likes, and thousands of comments. I clicked on the comment section. It was an absolute bloodbath. Thousands of strangers were tearing me apart. People were calling me a narcissist. They were calling me a disgrace to the culture. Some were tagging my corporate accounting firm, demanding that I be investigated for elder abuse and fired from my job. A few large community influencer pages had already stitched the video, using it as a talking point about toxic family members and the dangers of financial greed. Jasmine had pinned a comment to the top of the thread. It was a link to a GoFundMe page. The campaign title read, "Help Save Charles and Brenda's Home from Foreclosure." The fundraising goal was $100,000. I stared at the screen, the audacity of her scheme completely washing away any lingering sense of familial obligation I might have subconsciously held on to. Jasmine and Connor knew they could not get the loan from me at the steakhouse. They knew my parents were entirely tapped out, so they decided to weaponize the internet. They used my mother's lie to cast me as the villain, turning my parents into sympathetic victims, all to scam thousands of innocent strangers out of their hard-earned money to fund Connor's gambling addiction. They thought they had trapped me. They thought that by turning the court of public opinion against me, I would be forced into hiding, too humiliated to defend myself. They expected me to panic, to delete my social media, to beg them to take the video down. I locked my phone screen and set it gently on my desk. I did not panic. I did not cry. I looked up at the digital assignment of deed of trust still glowing on my monitor. Jasmine wanted an audience. She wanted the entire world to know about our family finances. She wanted to play the victim on a public stage. I picked up my tablet and opened my calendar. I had a week to prepare for the ultimate performance. If they wanted to make this public, I was going to give them a show they would never, ever forget. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, unforgiving sunlight that exposed every flaw in the city. I dressed in a tailored charcoal gray power suit, secured my hair in a sleek, low bun, and grabbed my leather briefcase. Jasmine's video had been circulating for 72 hours. It had crossed the boundaries of local family gossip and breached the algorithms of our entire metropolitan area. I knew exactly what was waiting for me when I stepped off the private elevator into the glass-enclosed lobby of my accounting firm. The silence that greeted me was deafening. Usually the reception area hummed with morning greetings and the clatter of espresso cups. Today, the administrative assistants abruptly stopped talking the second my red-bottom heels clicked against the Italian marble floor. I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms and felt the weight of a dozen sideways glances. As a senior forensic accountant, my entire career was built on impeccable integrity. I was the person corporations hired to find stolen money and testify in federal court. Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing when she accused me of financial elder abuse. She was not just trying to embarrass me, she was trying to destroy my livelihood. I walked into my corner office and shut the heavy oak door. My desk phone was already blinking with a voicemails indicator. Before I even sat down, my direct line rang. It was David, the managing partner of the firm. He asked me to step into his office. I did not sweat. I did not panic. I walked down the hall with my head held high, carrying a single manila folder. When I sat across from David, he looked uncomfortable, his hands clasped over his mahogany desk. Imani, he started carefully, his eyes darting to his computer screen where I could see the faint outline of the TikTok interface. It has come to the attention of the Human Resources Department that there is a viral video circulating on social media making some very severe allegations regarding your personal financial conduct. We do not normally get involved in family disputes, but given the nature of our work, the optics of this are incredibly concerning. I smiled calmly and slid the manila folder across his desk. I anticipated this conversation, David, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Inside that folder, you will find a certified letter from my private attorney, Julian. It contains a sworn affidavit and preliminary documentation proving that the claims made in that video are completely fabricated. In fact, I have recently had to initiate legal proceedings to protect my parents' assets from the very people who made that video. I am the victim of a targeted defamation campaign, and my legal counsel is handling it aggressively. David opened the folder, scanned the legal jargon, and visibly relaxed. A heavy sigh escaped his chest. He was a man who understood liability, and Julian's letterhead carried a terrifying amount of weight in this city. I apologize, Imani, David said, closing the folder. You know we have to protect the firm. But as long as your lawyer is handling it, your position here is completely secure. Let me know if you need any corporate legal resources to shut this down. I thanked him, walked back to my office, and locked my door. My job was safe. Jasmine's attempt to ruin my career had failed in less than 5 minutes because I operated with receipts, not emotions. But the battle outside these corporate walls was a completely different story. I sat at my desk and opened the GoFundMe link Jasmine had pinned to her viral video. The campaign had exploded over the weekend. The tracker bar was a bright, sickening green, creeping steadily toward the $100,000 goal. They had already raised over $45,000 in 3 days. I scrolled down to read the donor list and my stomach physically turned. These were not just anonymous internet strangers throwing away $5. These were people from my community. I saw a $50 donation from Miss Helen, the elderly usher at our church, who lived on a fixed income. I saw $200 from my old high school track coach. I saw donations from local Black-owned businesses, women empowerment groups, and former neighbors. The comments attached to the donations were agonizing to read. They wrote messages of solidarity, completely unaware they were being milked. They said things like, "Praying for your parents." "Jasmine, it breaks my heart to see Black elders taken advantage of." Another wrote, "Stay strong." "Connor, real men protect their families. We are rooting for your business." It was a masterclass in manipulation. Jasmine had weaponized the collective trauma and empathy of our community. She knew that Black folks deeply respected their elders and fiercely despised anyone who exploited them. She had painted my parents as helpless, impoverished victims and presented Connor as the struggling, honorable patriarch trying to save them. She was taking money from people who actually worked for a living, people who trusted our family, and funneling it directly into Connor's pockets. And the most disgusting part was that none of this money was going to save the house. Not a single dime of that GoFundMe would ever touch a mortgage payment or an emergency fund. I knew Connor. The moment that money hit his account, it would be wired straight to an offshore sportsbook to chase his losses. He was literally crowdsourcing his gambling addiction using my face as the villain. My cell phone vibrated with a text from my best friend Maya. She sent a screenshot of a local community social media group where my name was being dragged through the mud by women I had known since childhood. "They are planning to protest outside your building," Imani, Maya texted, her words frantic. "Jasmine just posted an update saying you refused to answer her calls and that Charles is skipping his blood pressure medication because you froze their accounts. You need to put out a statement. You need to defend yourself. This is getting dangerous." I read Maya's message, understanding her panic. In the court of public opinion, silence is almost always interpreted as guilt. When you are being publicly attacked, the natural human instinct is to immediately scream the truth, to post the bank statements, to go live on social media and beg the world to believe you. But I was not going to play Jasmine's game. If I posted a rebuttal online, it would just turn into a digital shouting match. My parents would double down on their lies to save face. The internet would divide into sides analyzing the drama for entertainment, while Connor quietly withdrew the GoFundMe cash and disappeared. No social media was an amateur's battlefield. I was going to handle this the way wealthy, powerful people handled their enemies. I was going to let them build their house of cards as high as possible. I was going to let them collect the money, soak up the sympathy, and stand at the absolute peak of their fake victorious mountain. Because the higher they climbed, the more devastating the fall would be when I pulled the foundation out from under them. I texted Maya back. Let them talk. I am not posting a statement. Just be ready for next weekend. I closed the GoFundMe tab on my computer browser, the disgust I felt morphing into a cold, calculated focus. Jasmine had successfully made me the most hated woman in our community, but she had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that because I had been the obedient, quiet daughter my entire life, I would just swallow this public humiliation and disappear into the shadows. She forgot that an auditor never exposes a fraud while the criminal is still hiding. An auditor waits until the criminal is standing under the brightest spotlight holding the stolen money with nowhere left to run. They wanted to perform for the church, the community, and the internet. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I decided I would not wait for the anniversary party to make my first move. I was going to walk right into the lion's den. The weekend was approaching, and I was going to attend Sunday service. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy downpour, the kind of rain that usually kept half the congregation of Mount Zion Baptist Church at home. But I knew my family would be there. For my father, church attendance was not about spiritual nourishment. It was a weekly public relations campaign. I stood in my massive walk-in closet and carefully selected my armor for the morning. I did not choose something dark or modest to blend into the background. I chose a tailored, pristine ivory white suit with wide-leg trousers and a silk blouse. I paired it with gold jewelry and a pair of white designer heels. I looked like a woman who was entirely at peace, completely untouched by the digital mob my sister had unleashed upon me over the weekend. I drove my car into the church parking lot right as the opening hymns were beginning. The sanctuary of Mount Zion was massive with towering stained glass windows and rows of polished oak pews. As I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors and stepped into the carpeted foyer, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The two head ushers women, who had known me since I was a little girl in ruffled socks, stopped mid-sentence. Their eyes widened, scanning my outfit and taking in my calm demeanor. Thanks to Jasmine's viral video, I was currently the most famous villain in our community. They fully expected me to be hiding in shame. Instead, I handed them my wet umbrella with a polite smile, took a church bulletin, and walked straight through the center doors into the main sanctuary. The choir was swaying in their purple robes, singing a joyful gospel track, but the music faded into white noise as I made my way down the center aisle. I could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes locking onto me. Whispers erupted from the pews like a sudden gust of wind. People were elbowing their spouses, pointing discreetly, and murmuring about my audacity. I did not sit in the back row. I did not hide in the balcony. I walked all the way to the front. My family claimed their usual territory in the second row, the prime real estate reserved for the most influential members of the church. My father, Charles, was wearing his sharpest deacon suit, sitting tall and looking incredibly solemn. My mother, Brenda, was sitting next to him, holding a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken matriarch. Jasmine and Connor sat on the end of the pew. Jasmine was wearing a modest dark dress, leaning her head on Connor's shoulder to project the image of a fragile wife relying on her strong husband. I stepped into the third row directly behind them and sat down. The soft rustle of my silk blouse was enough to make my father turn his head. When Charles saw me sitting less than 3 feet behind him, his jaw actually dropped. He blinked rapidly, his rigid posture instantly crumbling into visible panic. He nudged my mother. Brenda slowly turned around, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She quickly pulled her lace handkerchief to her chest, as if my presence alone was a physical assault. "Good morning," I whispered softly, offering them both a serene, unbothered smile. Jasmine whipped her head around her face, instantly contorting with silent rage. She had spent the last 3 days telling the internet that I was a monster who had abandoned them to starve, and here I was glowing with health and wealth, sitting right behind her in the house of the Lord. Connor refused to look back at me. He just stiffened his shoulders and stared intensely at the pulpit. The choir finished their song and Pastor Davis stepped up to the heavy wooden podium. Pastor Davis was a charismatic, booming speaker who had been running the church for 20 years. He and my father played golf together every other Wednesday. I knew for a fact that Charles had spent hours in the pastor's office this week, feeding him the exact narrative he wanted the congregation to hear. Pastor Davis adjusted his microphone and looked out over the crowd. His eyes locked directly onto me for a fraction of a second before he looked away, his expression turning grave and theatrical. "Church family." Pastor Davis began, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "Today the Lord has placed a heavy burden on my heart. We are going to deviate from our scheduled scripture. Today we need to talk about the decay of the modern family. We need to talk about the spirit of greed that is capturing our youth and tearing apart the sacred bonds of blood." A chorus of soft amens rippled through the congregation. My mother let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, dabbing her completely dry eyes with her handkerchief. "We raise our children with the sweat of our brows," Pastor Davis preached, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "We put roofs over their heads. We make sacrifices so they can go to those fancy corporate colleges and get those big downtown jobs. And how do some of them repay us? With arrogance, with cold hearts. They get a little bit of money, they get a fancy car, and suddenly they are too good for the village that raised them." The entire sanctuary was buzzing now. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. Half the church had probably donated to Jasmine's fake GoFundMe campaign. "The Bible tells us to honor our father and our mother," the pastor shouted, slamming his hand against the pulpit. "But we have ungrateful daughters out here abandoning their blood. We have children hoarding their wealth while their elderly parents suffer. They hack into bank accounts. They run away from their responsibilities. They let the devil replace their family loyalty with selfish pride. Let me tell you something, church, all the money in the world will not buy you a seat in heaven when you have crushed the hearts of the parents who gave you life." It was a masterfully manipulative performance. It was a direct, targeted assassination of my character, wrapped in the protective armor of a Sunday sermon. For any other woman, the sheer psychological pressure of being publicly shamed by a spiritual authority figure in front of her entire community would have been unbearable. It was designed to break me. It was designed to make me stand up, run down the aisle in tears, and beg my parents for forgiveness just to stop the public humiliation. I did none of those things. I crossed my legs, smoothed the crisp fabric of my ivory trousers, and sat perfectly still. I did not bow my head in shame. I kept my chin elevated, my posture completely relaxed, and my eyes locked directly on Pastor Davis. I maintained a soft, unblinking, incredibly calm smile on my face. The power of my absolute stillness began to suffocate them. When Pastor Davis looked down at me, expecting to see a broken, weeping sinner, he instead saw a forensic accountant who knew the exact balance of his church's offshore building fund. His booming voice faltered for a second. He quickly shifted his gaze to the balcony, visibly unsettled by my lack of reaction. My father was squirming in his seat. He kept checking his peripheral vision, expecting me to flee. When I remained firmly planted, radiating peace, his neck turned a dark shade of red. Brenda stopped pretending to cry because her fake tears were not generating the desired effect on me. Jasmine was aggressively tapping her foot against the wooden pew, her entire body vibrating with frustration. Her grand plan to have me publicly humiliated was failing in real time because I simply refused to accept the shame they were trying to hand me. When the sermon finally concluded, the ushers began passing the brass collection plates down the aisles. When the velvet-lined plate reached my row, I reached into my designer purse. I did not pull out a standard check or a crumpled $20 bill. I pulled out a crisp, newly printed $100 bill. I held it between my fingers, just long enough for my father to see it out of the corner of his eye. I dropped it onto the brass plate. It was a silent, devastating reminder. They could preach about my greed all they wanted, but I was the only person in this entire building with the liquid cash to actually save them from the financial grave they had dug for themselves. The service ended with a final prayer. The congregation stood up to leave, and the tension in the room snapped like a tightrope. I picked up my umbrella and my purse, stepping out of the pew. My family scrambled to get away from me, moving toward the side exit as quickly as possible to avoid a confrontation. But I was not here to argue with my parents. I was here to let them see me shine. I walked slowly down the center aisle, nodding politely to the staring congregants, completely unbothered by their whispers. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the cool, damp air of the church parking lot. I was walking toward my luxury sedan when I heard the heavy, aggressive crunch of footsteps on the wet gravel behind me. I stopped and turned around. Connor was marching toward me, his face pale and twisted with absolute rage. He had slipped away from Jasmine and Charles, seeking me out, away from the eyes of the congregation. He thought I was vulnerable out here in the parking lot. He had absolutely no idea that I was wearing a smartwatch, and I was already pressing record. The rain had reduced to a freezing mist by the time I reached the far end of the church parking lot. My luxury sedan was parked under the shade of a large oak tree, isolated from the crowded rows of minivans and family cars. I pressed the button on my key fob, and the headlights flashed, illuminating the wet asphalt. I was just reaching for the sleek silver door handle when I heard the heavy, aggressive crunch of footsteps rapidly approaching from behind. "Imani, wait." The voice was sharp and demanding. I did not flinch. I slowly turned around and found Connor marching toward me. He had clearly sprinted away from Jasmine and my parents to catch me before I left the property. His face was flushed red, his tie was loosened, and the carefully crafted image of the respectful, wealthy son-in-law he had just portrayed inside the sanctuary was completely gone. In his eyes, I saw nothing but pure, unadulterated desperation masked as arrogance. He stepped directly into my personal space, standing far closer than any polite conversation warranted. He reached out and placed his hand flat against the window of my car door, physically blocking me from opening it. "You think you are so smart, do you not?" Connor sneered, his breath forming small white clouds in the cold air. "You think you can just walk into that church, drop $100 bill, and completely intimidate everyone? You think you can just ignore us and we will go away?" I looked down at his hand pressed against my window, and then I looked slowly back up to his face. "Remove your hand from my vehicle, Connor," I said, my voice dangerously calm. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He did not move his hand. "Oh, please. Drop the Ice Queen act, Imani. We both know exactly what you are doing. You are trying to starve us out. You wiped the smart home hub. You refused the loan. You think because you have a fancy corporate job and a nice car, you hold all the cards. But you do not. I do." I tilted my head slightly, observing him the way a scientist observes a rat in a maze. "You hold the cards," I repeated, allowing a small, mocking smile to touch the corners of my mouth. "Yes, I do." Connor snapped his chest, puffing out with unwarranted pride. "Have you checked TikTok this morning? Have you seen the GoFundMe page? The entire city hates you right now, Imani. People from your own church are giving us money because they think you are a monster. Your corporate firm is probably getting phone calls right now. You are completely ruined." He was practically vibrating with excitement. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He believed that public shaming was the ultimate weapon because it was the only weapon my parents had ever used against me. That video is a complete fabrication, Connor, I stated evenly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. You know it. Jasmine knows it. You are crowdsourcing your gambling debts under the guise of a fake startup. Connor smirked, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Of course, the video is a lie, he admitted, saying the words out loud without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. The startup is a joke. Jasmine will say whatever I tell her to say because she is terrified of looking like a failure. But the truth literally does not matter. It never matters. All that matters is what people want to believe. He leaned in closer, invading my space again, completely intoxicated by his own perceived power. His white privilege radiated from him like a toxic cologne. You still do not get it, do you, Imani? He whispered, his tone dripping with condescension. You can have all the money and all the fancy degrees in the world, but in this family, you will always be the loser. Your black parents will always protect my white tears over your success. Charles needs me. He needs to walk into the country club with me. He needs to tell his friends his daughter married a white entrepreneur. He will let me drain his bank accounts to zero before he ever admits to the world that he was conned by a guy like me. And Brenda will back him up every single time. Hearing him say the quiet part out loud was genuinely staggering. He understood the racial and social dynamics of my family perfectly. He knew exactly how to exploit my father's internalized need for proximity to whiteness and my mother's desperate obsession with social status. He knew they would throw their own flesh and blood to the wolves just to maintain the illusion he provided for them. They do not care about the truth, Imani. Connor continued, his voice growing louder, more confident. They care about the image, and right now my image is the struggling hero, and your image is the greedy, abusive daughter. I control the narrative. I maintained absolute silence. In forensic auditing, the most powerful tool you have is silence. When you let an arrogant man talk, he will inevitably hand you the rope to hang him with. So here is how this is going to work, Connor said, finally removing his hand from my car window and crossing his arms over his chest. He was ready to deliver his grand ultimatum. You are going to write me a check. Actually, no, a wire transfer. You are going to wire $50,000 to the Apex Digital account by Tuesday morning. I raised an eyebrow. $50,000. Consider it a public relations fee. Connor smiled, showing his teeth. You wire me the 50 grand and Jasmine will post a tearful update video. She will say there was a massive misunderstanding, that you came through for the family, and that all is forgiven. We will take down the GoFundMe. You get your reputation back, your bosses stop looking at you sideways, and you can go back to your lonely little corporate life. And if I refuse? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Connor chuckled darkly. If you refuse, I will have Jasmine make a new video every single day. I will have Charles stand up at testimony service next week and cry about how you are starving your own mother. I will personally call the ethics board at your accounting firm and file a formal complaint for elder abuse. I will make sure you cannot show your face anywhere in this city without someone spitting at your feet. $50,000, Imani. It is a bargain for your peace of mind. He stood there breathing heavily, entirely convinced he had just delivered a masterstroke of extortion. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He expected me to cry. He expected me to negotiate. He expected me to beg. I did not argue. I did not defend my honor. I did not even look angry. I simply reached up with my right hand and casually adjusted the sleeve of my ivory silk blouse. I tapped the face of my digital smartwatch twice. The tiny red recording icon on the screen blinked, entirely invisible to him, but perfectly clear to me. It had been running since the moment I heard his footsteps on the gravel. Every single threat, every admission of fraud, every racist taunt, and the explicit demand for $50,000 was now securely captured in high-definition audio and automatically uploaded to my encrypted cloud server. I looked Connor dead in the eyes. I let a slow, terrifyingly serene smile spread across my face. Tuesday morning, I said softly. Tuesday morning, Connor confirmed, matching my smile, entirely oblivious to the trap that had just snapped shut around his neck. Or, your life is over. Have a blessed Sunday, Connor, I replied smoothly. I pulled open my car door, slid into the luxurious leather driver's seat, and closed the heavy door, shutting out his smug face and the freezing mist. I pressed the ignition, the engine purring to life. As I backed out of the parking space and drove out of the church lot, I glanced down at the saved audio file on my dashboard display. Connor wanted $50,000 to clear my name. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the exact piece of evidence I needed to send him to federal prison for extortion, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The board was completely set, and the anniversary party was only 5 days away. On Monday morning, an overnight courier delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope to the reception desk of my corporate firm. It was marked highly confidential, which was incredibly ironic considering its contents. When I opened it at my desk, a heavy piece of cardstock slid out. It was bordered in embossed gold foil featuring elegant, sweeping calligraphy. Charles and Brenda request the honor of your presence at their Ruby Anniversary Gala, celebrating 40 years of marital excellence and family legacy. The venue listed at the bottom was the Oak Ridge Country Club, the most exclusive old money establishment in the entire metropolitan area. A membership there required a 6-figure initiation fee, and non-members could only rent the grand ballroom if they were sponsored and put down a massive non-refundable deposit. I stared at the gold lettering, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of their delusion. My parents were 60 days delinquent on a fraudulent second mortgage, their retirement accounts were completely empty, their credit cards were maxed out with cash advances, and yet they were throwing a massive black tie gala for 200 guests to celebrate a legacy that was currently being foreclosed on by an anonymous shell company that I owned. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and connected the financial dots. Oak Ridge Country Club was notorious for its strict billing policies. They required a 50% deposit upfront, and the remaining balance had to be settled by a credit card on file the night of the event before the dessert course was served. My parents did not have the cash for the final bill. Then I remembered the terrifyingly confident look on Connor's face in the church parking lot. He had demanded I wire him $50,000 by Tuesday morning. He had undoubtedly promised Charles and Brenda that his wildly successful tech startup would cover the entire final cost of their anniversary gala. He was banking on my extortion money to fund their extravagant social performance. He thought he had completely trapped me, assuming I would pay the ransom to protect my corporate reputation from Jasmine's viral video. Tuesday morning arrived with a quiet, beautiful sunrise. I sat at the marble island in my penthouse, drinking a freshly brewed espresso, and watched the digital clock on my oven tick past 9 a.m., then 10 a.m., then noon. I did not log into my banking portal. I did not initiate a wire transfer. I did not send Connor a single cent. My phone remained completely silent all day. Connor was far too cowardly to call and demand the money because calling me would mean admitting he had lost control of the situation. More importantly, he could not tell Charles and Brenda that the startup funds he promised them were actually supposed to be extorted from the daughter they had just kicked out of the house. He was entirely trapped in his own web of lies. He had to let the party proceed, sweating bullets, desperately hoping the country club would somehow fail to run the credit card authorization until after the weekend. IRSVPD to the gala with a single neatly typed word, attending. When Saturday evening finally arrived, I prepared for the event with the meticulous precision of a general dressing for a final decisive battle. I was stepping onto their ultimate battlefield, the social arena, where appearances meant everything. I needed my armor to be absolutely flawless. I was not going to show up looking like the stressed, isolated, financially abused daughter they portrayed me as on the internet. I was going to embody pure, unadulterated soft life success. I hired a private makeup artist and a hairstylist to come to my penthouse. They sculpted my hair into an elegant sweeping updo that showcased the sharp lines of my cheekbones and the delicate slope of my neck. I selected a custom-tailored ruby red silk gown, a subtle, almost mocking nod to their 40th anniversary theme. The dress was a masterpiece of modern architecture featuring a daring but sophisticated neckline and a sleek silhouette that cascaded to the floor. I paired it with diamond drop earrings and a matching tennis bracelet. I slid my feet into a pair of strappy metallic designer heels. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I did not see a victim. I saw a woman who possessed total financial and emotional sovereignty. I looked expensive. I looked untouchable. I drove my luxury sedan to the Oak Ridge Country Club, pulling up to the grand columned entrance. The circular driveway was packed with high-end vehicles, valet attendants rushing back and forth under the warm glow of the gas lanterns. I handed my keys to the attendant, stepped out of my car, and walked up the sweeping marble staircase toward the grand ballroom. The moment I stepped through the double mahogany doors, the sheer scale of the financial recklessness hit me. The ballroom was transformed into a sickeningly lavish wonderland. Massive, towering floral centerpieces of imported red roses adorned every single table. A 10-piece live jazz band was playing on an elevated stage. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos were circulating with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. An enormous, intricately carved ice sculpture of a swan sat in the center of the room, slowly dripping into a silver basin. It was a beautiful party, entirely funded by fraud and stolen equity. The guest list was a who is who of our local community. I saw the pastor from our church, the elderly ushers, the flying monkey aunts and uncles who had sent me hateful text messages, and dozens of people who had probably donated to Jasmine's fake GoFundMe campaign. As I glided across the polished hardwood floor toward the bar, the whispers began. It started as a subtle ripple, a turning of heads and a widening of eyes. They had all watched Jasmine's tearful TikTok video. They expected me to be hiding in shame, or at the very least to look stressed and remorseful. Instead, I looked like I owned the entire building. The juxtaposition between the tragic narrative my family had sold them and the radiant, wealthy reality I presented caused an immediate, visible cognitive dissonance among the guests. People actually stepped out of my way as I approached the bar, too intimidated by my presence to offer any of the insults they had so easily typed online. I ordered a glass of vintage sparkling water with a twist of lime. As I turned around, resting my hand gracefully on the marble bar top, I spotted my family. They were standing near the entrance in a formal receiving line, acting like royalty, accepting tributes from their loyal subjects. Charles was wearing a custom-fitted tuxedo, his chest puffed out with absolute pride as he shook hands with the pastor. Brenda was draped in a sequined gown, her neck dripping with what I knew were cubic zirconia jewels disguised as diamonds, laughing loudly at a joke someone made. Jasmine was standing next to her, wearing a stunning black evening gown, playing the role of the devoted, beautiful daughter. And then there was Connor. Connor looked physically ill. While my parents and sister were soaking up the adoration, Connor was sweating profusely. His tuxedo looked slightly rumpled, his face was pale, and he kept nervously checking his watch and glancing toward the heavy doors leading to the catering kitchen. He knew the deadline for the final bill was rapidly approaching, and he knew his bank account was completely empty. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and began walking directly toward them. Jasmine spotted me first. Her fake camera-ready smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. She nudged Brenda, who turned around and literally gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Charles stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto my ruby-red gown. The entire receiving line ground to an agonizing halt. The guests waiting to greet them sensed the sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere and nervously stepped back, giving us a wide berth. I stopped a few feet in front of them, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered peace. "Happy anniversary, Charles and Brenda." I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and perfectly audible to the surrounding guests. "The venue is absolutely breathtaking. You really spared no expense." My father's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "What are you doing here, Imani?" he hissed, keeping his voice dangerously low so the pastor would not hear. After what you did to this family, you have the absolute nerve to show your face at our celebration. I received an invitation. I replied innocently, offering a polite smile. I would not miss this night for the world. Brenda stepped forward, her eyes darting nervously around the room to see who was watching. You need to leave right now, she whispered venomously. You are not going to ruin our special night with your jealousy. We do not want you here. I looked past my mother and locked eyes with Connor. He was staring at me like he was looking at a ghost. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his bow tie. He had threatened to destroy my life if I did not pay him $50,000 by Tuesday. It was now Saturday night, and here I was looking better than I ever had, holding a crystal glass and smiling right in his face. Oh, I think Connor wants me here, I said, holding his terrified gaze. Do you not, Connor? After all, someone has to appreciate all the hard work you put into financing this beautiful family legacy. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. A bead of sweat rolled down his pale forehead. Jasmine crossed her arms, trying to step in front of her husband to protect him. Do not talk to him, Amani. You are just mad because everyone knows the truth about you now. Just leave before security escorts you out. I laughed, a soft, rich sound that seemed to rattle them even more. I am not going anywhere, Jasmine. I am going to find my seat, enjoy the expensive catering, and celebrate this beautiful family. I turned my back on them before they could formulate another threat and walked gracefully toward the dining tables. I could feel their furious, panicked eyes burning into my back. I found my assigned seat at a table near the back of the room, surrounded by distant cousins who suddenly found their napkins incredibly interesting and refused to make eye contact with me. I sat down, smoothed my silk skirt, and watched the head table. The trap was perfectly set. The country club was about to drop the hammer, and I had the best seat in the house to watch the fake empire burn. The waiters moved seamlessly through the grand ballroom, placing plates of perfectly seared filet mignon and butter-poached lobster tails in front of the 200 guests. I cut into my steak, the knife gliding effortlessly through the expensive meat, and chewed slowly. The live jazz band played a smooth rendition of a classic rhythm and blues track, filling the massive room with an atmosphere of old money elegance. It was an elegance my parents were currently renting with a stolen credit line. The sheer cognitive dissonance of the evening was fascinating to observe. My tablemates, the distant cousins and aunts who had spent the last week ignoring my text messages and gossiping about me online, were now stealing sideways glances at me. They were desperately trying to figure out how the villain of Jasmine's viral video could sit here eating lobster with such terrifying serenity. Suddenly, the jazz band brought their song to a soft, graceful close. The subtle clinking of silverware against fine china faded as my father stood up at the center of the head table. Charles tapped his crystal champagne flute with a heavy silver spoon. The sharp, clear ringing commanded the immediate attention of the entire ballroom. He adjusted his custom-fitted tuxedo jacket, cleared his throat with a heavy dose of self-importance, and took the wireless microphone handed to him by the catering manager. Charles began his speech with the practiced melodic cadence of a seasoned church deacon. He talked extensively about his 40 years of marriage to Brenda, painting a glorious picture of relentless dedication, mutual sacrifice, and the building of a strong Black family legacy. He quoted scripture about a wise man building his house upon a rock. He talked about the financial struggles they faced in their early years, and the mighty empire they had supposedly built from the ground up through nothing but hard work and prayer. The crowd hung on to every single word. Miss Helen, the elderly usher who had donated $50 to Jasmine's fraudulent campaign, was nodding enthusiastically from a table near the front. My mother sat beside Charles, dabbing her completely dry eyes with a silk napkin, playing the role of the humble, exhausted matriarch to absolute perfection. But then Charles shifted his tone. The warm, nostalgic cadence hardened into something sharp, cold, and incredibly pointed. As I look out at all of you tonight, Charles said, his deep voice echoing through the massive acoustic speakers. I am reminded that a man's true legacy is not found in his bank account. It is found in the children he raises. It is found in the loyalty of his bloodline. We all know that raising a family is not easy in this modern era. Sometimes the world corrupts the people you love. Sometimes the children you sacrifice absolutely everything for turn their backs on you the second they get a little bit of money and a taste of the secular world. They forget the village that built them. They forget the sacred commandment to honor their father and mother. The ballroom went dead silent. 200 heads subtly shifted in my direction. They all knew exactly who he was talking about. My cousins at my table actually leaned away from me, as if my proximity might infect them with my alleged treachery. I did not break my gaze. I did not look down at my plate. I picked up my crystal water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down precisely on the linen coaster. Charles turned his attention away from the crowd and looked down at Jasmine and Connor. But God is faithful. Charles continued, his voice rising in absolute triumph. God always leaves you a remnant of loyalty. Jasmine, my beautiful youngest daughter, and Connor, the son I never had but always prayed for. You two have shown this entire community what true family looks like. When times got hard, you did not run away to a downtown penthouse. You stayed right there in the trenches with us. Connor, you are building a massive tech business, a true corporate empire, and yet you still find time to protect this family. You are the future of our legacy. Charles asked Jasmine and Connor to stand and join him at the center of the elevated stage. Jasmine walked over gracefully, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek for the audience. Connor followed close behind, puffing out his chest, looking like the absolute savior of the entire community. Charles put one arm around Jasmine and the other around Connor. Brenda and I have spent weeks praying about the future of our estate, Charles announced to the breathless room. We have decided that we do not want to wait until we pass away to bless the people who truly deserve it. We want to see our legacy flourish while we are still alive to enjoy it. Charles signaled to Brenda. My mother stood up, holding a sleek leather-bound folio in her hands. She walked over and handed it to Connor with a look of absolute reverence. Therefore, Charles boomed into the microphone, his voice dripping with dramatic flair. Effective immediately, Brenda and I are legally transferring the deed to our family home, the house we built with our own hands, over to Jasmine and Connor as an early inheritance. It is fully paid off, and it belongs to them now. They are the only ones worthy of carrying the family name forward. The ballroom absolutely erupted. 200 people stood up clapping and cheering for the incredible generosity of my parents. It was a massive standing ovation for a complete and total lie. Connor opened the leather folio and pulled out a piece of thick parchment paper. He held it high above his head for the entire crowd to see. It was intricately designed to look like an official property deed, complete with a shiny gold foil seal at the bottom. The crowd cheered even louder, snapping photos on their smartphones. I sat completely still in my chair, my hands resting gracefully in my lap, observing the absolute absurdity of the performance. My forensic accountant brain dissected the moment with clinical precision. The house was not fully paid off. It was heavily encumbered by a fraudulent $250,000 second mortgage. And the document Connor was waving around like a championship trophy was completely fake. It was unnotarized, unregistered, and legally meaningless. Connor could not legally transfer the deed to himself because the house was already 60 days in default, and the primary lien holder was the anonymous shell company I had established days ago. He was holding up a theater prop in a stage play of his own making. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Thank you, Mom and Dad," she cried softly. "We promise to honor this house and use it to build black wealth for generations to come." Connor stepped up to the microphone next, looking out at the cheering crowd with a sickeningly humble smile. "I just want to say how blessed I am to be embraced by this incredible community," Connor said smoothly, leaning heavily into his white savior complex. Charles and Brenda are the absolute definition of Black excellence. And to anyone out there who thinks they can tear this family apart with greed and selfishness, you will never win. Love and loyalty always win. More applause washed over the room. Connor looked out across the sea of clapping guests and locked eyes directly with me. He gave me a tiny, imperceptible smirk. He thought he had completely outplayed me. He thought that by having Charles publicly hand over the fake deed, he had cemented his ownership of the property in the eyes of the entire city. He was daring me to stand up and object. He was practically begging me to cause a scene so I would look like the bitter, jealous older sister crashing the party. Then my mother locked eyes with me. Brenda stood at the center of the stage, the glittering cubic zirconia shining brightly under the crystal chandeliers. She stared directly at me through the crowd of standing guests. The look on her face was one of absolute, unadulterated triumph. It was a look of pure, concentrated spite. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of being publicly replaced. She wanted me to know that she had chosen a white con artist over her own flesh and blood, and she wanted me to suffer deeply for it. I did not suffer. I looked right back at my mother and I smiled. It was not a tight, polite smile. It was a wide, genuine, completely relaxed smile. I raised my crystal glass of sparkling water and tilted it slightly in her direction, offering a silent, elegant toast to her magnificent performance. Brenda frowned, her triumphant expression faltering slightly. My lack of devastation genuinely confused her. She expected me to burst into tears. She expected me to storm out of the ballroom in a fit of rage. She did not understand why the woman she had just publicly disinherited was sitting comfortably at her table radiating soft life energy, looking like she was enjoying a private joke that no one else in the room understood. They were standing on a stage built entirely of lies, holding a fake deed to a house I legally controlled, eating a $75 steak dinner they had absolutely no way to pay for. They had played their final card. The grand illusion had reached its absolute peak. Now all I had to do was sit back, enjoy the live music, and wait for the country club management to bring them the final catering bill. The dessert course was just beginning to arrive at the tables. Waiters in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays loaded with slices of dark chocolate ganache cake and fresh raspberries. The jazz band had transitioned to an upbeat tempo, and the energy in the room was soaring on the fumes of my parents' magnificent performance. They were still sitting at the head table accepting the adoring smiles of their guests, completely intoxicated by their own fabricated reality. I sat back in my chair watching the entrance of the ballroom with a quiet sense of anticipation. I knew the operational protocols of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The final catering invoice was always presented right before the dessert service concluded. If the balance was not settled, the event was immediately halted. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The catering manager stepped through. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with a completely unreadable expression, holding a sleek black leather checkbook. He did not look at the band or the dancing guests. He made a direct, purposeful line straight toward the head table. I watched as he leaned down and whispered something into my father's ear. Charles smiled confidently, nodding, as if this was merely a trivial formality. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom tuxedo jacket and pulled out a gold credit card. He handed it to the manager without even looking at the bill. The manager nodded politely, took the card, and walked back toward the administrative offices. The jazz band played on. My mother continued laughing with the pastor. Connor took a large gulp of his wine, his eyes darting nervously toward the doors. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Less than 5 minutes later, the catering manager returned. This time his pace was slightly faster, and his professional smile had completely vanished. He walked back to Charles and leaned down again, shielding his mouth with his hand as he spoke. I could see my father's posture stiffen from across the room. The confident smile slid right off his face. He quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out another card, this one a standard platinum bank card, and handed it over. The manager shook his head, refusing to take the second card. He opened the black leather booklet and placed it directly on the table in front of Charles. He leaned in closer, his voice undoubtedly firmer this time. Even from a distance, I could read the aggressive tension in the manager's shoulders. The country club had run the first card. It was declined. They had probably run the card Charles put on file for the deposit, too. Declined. Every single line of credit my father possessed was maxed out to the absolute limit. The total remaining balance for the extravagant floral arrangements, the filet mignon, the open bar, and the 10-piece band was $15,000. And Charles did not have 15 cents of available credit to his name. Panic began to set in at the head table. Brenda noticed the interaction and leaned over, whispering frantically to Charles. My father pointed a thick finger at Connor. I watched as Charles demanded Connor hand over the corporate card for his highly successful tech startup. Connor physically recoiled. His face turned the color of ash. He patted his pockets, shaking his head, stammering out an excuse I could not hear but could easily imagine. He was telling them he left his wallet in the car, or that his accounts were frozen for a massive international wire transfer. He was stalling, but the catering manager was not a man who accepted excuses. The manager tapped his finger against the final invoice. He gave my father a single definitive nod, indicating that the $15,000 needed to be paid immediately, or the police would be called for theft of services, and the event would be publicly shut down. Charles stood up. His chest was heaving, his face a dark mask of absolute desperation and boiling rage. He looked out over the sea of 200 guests, all of whom were happily eating the expensive cake he could not pay for. Then his eyes locked onto me. He remembered the mahogany-paneled steakhouse. He remembered the heavy metallic clink of my solid titanium American Express Centurion card hitting the silver tray. He remembered that I possessed the exact kind of unlimited liquid wealth he desperately needed to save his crumbling empire. Charles stepped away from the head table and began marching across the ballroom floor. He did not care that people were staring. He did not care that the music was playing. He was operating on pure, narcissistic survival instinct. He reached my table, his heavy footsteps stopping right behind my chair. The distant cousins who had been ignoring me all night suddenly froze, their forks suspended in the air. Imani, my father ordered, his voice a harsh, demanding whisper that vibrated with barely contained fury. Give me your card. I slowly turned my head to look at him. I did not blink. Give you my card, I repeated, ensuring my voice was loud enough for the entire table to hear. Do not play games with me right now, Imani. Charles hissed, his hands balling into fists at his sides. There is a temporary hold on my accounts. I need your black card to settle the catering bill. Give it to me right now. I will pay you back on Monday. Save this family from embarrassment and hand over the card. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Less than 20 minutes ago, he had stood on a stage with a microphone and publicly declared that Jasmine and Connor were the only people worthy of the family legacy. He had formally disinherited me in front of our entire community. And now, the moment the bill arrived for his majestic performance, he expected me to quietly open my purse and finance his delusion. He expected the scapegoat to pay for the golden child's inheritance. I looked at the veins bulging in his neck. I looked at the sheer panic in his eyes. He actually believed I would do it. He believed that the ingrained conditioning of my childhood, the desperate need to protect the family name, would force my hand. I pushed my chair back and slowly stood up to my full height. I smoothed down the fabric of my ruby-red silk gown. I picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water, holding it delicately by the stem. I am not going to save you, Charles, I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the room with absolute clarity. You just gave your entire legacy to Connor. Tell him to pay the bill. My father stepped forward, his face twisting into a snarl. You disrespectful little girl, he threatened, stepping directly into my personal space. I am your father. You will give me that card, or so help me God, I will make sure you never. I did not let him finish the threat. I turned my back on him entirely. I walked away from the table, leaving him standing there, completely paralyzed by his own impotence. I did not walk toward the exit. I did not run away from the confrontation. I walked directly toward the elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. As I approached the stage, the guests began to realize something was terribly wrong. The whispers intensified. The jazz band faltered, the saxophone player lowering his instrument as he watched me ascend the velvet-lined stairs. I bypassed the DJ booth and walked straight to the main audiovisual console that controlled the massive LED screen spanning the back wall. The audiovisual technician tried to step in my way, but I handed him a folded $100 bill and pointed to the auxiliary input cable. He took the money, stepped aside, and handed me the cord. I pulled my secure digital tablet from my clutch purse, plugged the cable into the charging port, and synced the display. The giant LED wall behind me flickered for a split second before mirroring my tablet screen in glorious high definition. I walked to the center of the stage and picked up the wireless microphone my father had used to disinherit me. I looked out over the ballroom. 200 people were staring at me in absolute stunned silence. My father was still standing frozen near my table. My mother was gripping the edge of the head table so tightly her knuckles were white. Jasmine looked terrified, and Connor looked like he was about to pass out. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing through the massive speakers. It was cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a forensic auditor presenting evidence to a federal grand jury. My father just gave a beautiful speech about family legacy, loyalty, and financial blessings. But since we are gathered here to celebrate the truth, I think it is only fair we look at the actual accounting. I tapped the screen of my tablet. I opened the first file. It was the high-definition audio recording from the church parking lot. I pressed play, and the volume blasted through the concert-grade speakers. Connor's voice filled the room, sharp and arrogant. "Of course the video is a lie. The startup is a joke. Jasmine will say whatever I tell her to say because she is terrified of looking like a failure. But the truth literally does not matter. It never matters. All that matters is what people want to believe." A collective horrified gasp erupted from the audience. Miss Helen dropped her fork. The pastor stood up from his chair. The audio continued. "You still do not get it, do you, Imani? You can have all the money and all the fancy degrees in the world, but in this family, you will always be the loser. Your black parents will always protect my white tears over your success. Charles needs me. He will let me drain his bank accounts to zero before he ever admits to the world that he was conned by a guy like me." My mother let out a loud, piercing scream, covering her ears, as if she could physically block the sound of her own humiliation. My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. The recording reached the final extortion demand. "You are going to wire $50,000 to the Apex Digital account by Tuesday morning. Consider it a public relations fee. You wire me the 50 grand and Jasmine will post a tearful update video. Or your life is over." I paused the audio. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I looked directly at Connor. "That was last Sunday," I said into the microphone. "But the fraud started long before that. Let us take a look at the tech empire Connor has been building." I tapped my tablet again. The LED wall shifted from the audio file to a massive, perfectly organized financial spreadsheet. I projected Charles and Brenda's retirement account statements, highlighting the massive withdrawals in bright yellow. Then I projected the digital tracing software that followed the money. "This is the Apex Digital Innovations corporate account," I explained, pointing to the screen. "And these are the destination IP addresses where every single penny of my parents' retirement funds was wired. They are offshore sports books and unregulated online casinos based in Costa Rica and Malta. Connor is not an entrepreneur. He is a gambling addict who completely drained his in-laws' life savings. And that GoFundMe campaign Jasmine posted claiming I stole from them. Every dollar you donated went straight into this exact same gambling account. You did not help a struggling black family. You funded a white con artist." The crowd erupted into absolute chaos. People were shouting. The guests who had donated to the GoFundMe were furious, demanding their money back. Uncle Vernon, who had sent me those hateful text messages, was staring at the screen in pure disbelief. But I was not finished. I tapped the tablet one final time. And finally, I announced, raising my voice to cut through the shouting. Let us talk about the beautiful family home that Charles so generously transferred to Jasmine and Connor tonight. The digital scan of the predatory second mortgage appeared on the massive screen. It was 50 feet tall, impossible for anyone to ignore. 14 months ago, Connor forged my father's signature on this deed of trust to take out $250,000 loan against the house to cover his gambling debts, I explained, zooming in on the forged signature. He stopped making payments 2 months ago. The house is currently in default. That piece of paper Connor held up earlier is completely fake. Charles does not own the house. Connor does not own the house. I pulled up the assignment of deed of trust from my LLC. Because the bank was about to foreclose, I bought the defaulted debt myself, I said, staring directly at my father. Obsidian Equity Partners is my company. I am the primary lien holder. I own the debt, which means I own the house. You cannot give away a legacy you already lost, Charles. And consider this public announcement your official notice of eviction. Jasmine completely snapped. She let out a hysterical, guttural scream and charged the stage. She scrambled up the velvet stairs, her expensive black evening gown tearing at the hem, lunging desperately toward the audiovisual console. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, clawing frantically at the cables connecting my tablet to the system. "Turn it off right now, you jealous monster!" Before she could yank the cord, 2 massive security guards in black suits intercepted her. The catering manager had already called them to deal with the unpaid bill, and they were primed for action. They grabbed Jasmine by the arms, pulling her away from the equipment. She thrashed wildly, screaming and crying, the perfect picture of the spoiled golden child, completely unraveling when forced to face reality. Connor tried to run. He pushed his way past the head table and sprinted toward the kitchen exit, abandoning his wife and my parents. But a third security guard stepped in front of the double doors, crossing his arms and blocking the exit. The country club was not letting anyone leave until the police arrived to investigate the $15,000 theft of services. I unplugged my tablet, slipped it quietly back into my clutch, and set the microphone down on the podium. The fake empire had completely burned to the ground, and I was the only one holding a fire extinguisher. The security guards held Jasmine firmly by the arms as she continued to thrash and sob, her cries echoing painfully through the grand ballroom. I stood at the center of the stage, looking down at my father. Charles was gripping the edge of the head table, his knuckles completely white, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the financial trap that had just snapped shut around him. He shook his head, refusing to accept the reality I had just projected onto the massive screen. "You cannot do this, Imani," Charles stammered, his deep, authoritative voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. "You are my daughter. You cannot just buy the mortgage and take our home. That is illegal. I will take you to court. I will sue you. I will pay you the back mortgage myself." I looked at him with absolute pity. He was a man who had spent his entire life commanding respect through intimidation, and now he was completely drowning in his own ignorance. He did not understand how corporate finance worked, and he certainly did not understand how hard money lending operated. "You cannot pay me the back mortgage, Charles Weiss," I stated calmly, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "You do not have a single dollar to your name. Connor drained your retirement. Your credit cards are maxed out to the absolute limit. You cannot even pay for the steak you just ate." I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, folded legal document bearing the official seal of the county clerk. I walked slowly down the velvet-lined steps of the stage, the guests parting like the Red Sea to let me through. I stopped directly in front of my father and held the document out to him. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely take it from my grasp. "I did not just buy your defaulted debt, Charles," I explained, my tone clinical and precise. "Apex Alternative Lending filed the notice of default 60 days ago. You ignored the warnings because Connor was intercepting your mail to hide his crimes. When my company Obsidian Equity Partners purchased the promissory note, we also purchased the right to execute the final steps of the foreclosure. Charles stared blindly at the legal jargon on the paper, his eyes darting back and forth but comprehending absolutely nothing. "You cannot give the house to Connor, Dad," I said, leaning in just slightly so he could feel the absolute chill of my words. "Because as of 9 a.m. yesterday morning, the county judge signed the final order. My LLC officially executed the foreclosure. The title has been formally transferred. I do not just hold your debt anymore. I own the physical house. I am your landlord. And since you kicked me out into the street on my birthday, consider this document your official 30-day eviction notice." The heavy, embossed piece of paper slipped from my father's trembling fingers and fluttered to the polished hardwood floor. His knees physically buckled. He reached out and grabbed the back of a dining chair to stop himself from collapsing. The patriarch of the family, the man who had stood at the pulpit for 20 years preaching about his untouchable legacy, was entirely broken. His fake empire had been reduced to a piece of paper on the floor. A wave of frantic murmurs swept through the country club. The community members who had idolized him were now looking at him with absolute disgust. The pastor, the man Charles had played golf with every Wednesday, stood up from his table, shook his head in profound disappointment, and walked toward the exit without saying a single word. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the fraudulent mess my family had created. My mother finally broke her silence. The reality of losing her massive colonial house, her country club status, and her entire social identity hit her all at once. Brenda lunged away from the head table, pushing past the remaining guests, and rushed toward me. The fake, composed matriarch was completely gone. Her mascara was running down her cheeks, and her expensive gown dragged heavily on the floor. "Imani, please," Brenda sobbed, reaching out with both hands to grab my arms. She was crying real, desperate tears now. "Please do not do this. We are your family. I am your mother. You cannot put us out on the street. We had no idea what Connor was doing. We were trying to protect Jasmine. You have to forgive us. You have so much money, Imani, you can fix this. Please save us." I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely inadequate. I looked at the hands that had snatched my dignity away time and time again. I stepped back, breaking her grip on my silk sleeves. "You stopped being my family the night you handed me an eviction notice and told me I was a burden," I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You chose a white con artist over your own daughter because he made you feel closer to wealth. You helped Jasmine raise $45,000 from innocent people by calling me an abuser. You made your choice, Brenda. Now you get to live in the house that choice built. But you will not be living in my house." I turned away from her sobbing figure and looked toward the back of the room. Connor was still trapped by the exit doors. The catering manager had stepped forward, flanked by the massive security guards. "Sir," the catering manager said loudly, his voice echoing over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. "The police have been dispatched. You are not leaving this building until the $15,000 balance for this event is settled in full." Connor looked like a cornered rat. He pointed a shaking finger at Charles, completely abandoning the family he had just sworn to protect. "Ask him," Connor yelled, his voice cracking in panic. "It is his anniversary party. I do not have any money." The utter cowardice of his betrayal was the final nail in the coffin. Jasmine, still being held back by security, watched her husband throw her father under the bus. She stopped screaming and simply stared at Connor in absolute horrified shock. The illusion of her perfect marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I picked up my purse from the table. I did not need to say another word. The truth was entirely exposed, the financial debts were called in, and the toxic cycle I had been trapped in since childhood was permanently broken. I walked purposefully toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. Nobody tried to stop me. The flying monkey aunts and uncles who had texted me such hateful words simply lowered their eyes, too ashamed to even look in my direction. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The valet brought my luxury sedan around immediately. I tipped him generously, slid into the plush leather driver's seat, and closed the door. The silence inside the cabin was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. As I drove away from the Oak Ridge Country Club, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the approaching police cruisers in my rearview mirror, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating cape of the strong black woman who was expected to save her abusers had fallen off forever. I felt incredibly, wonderfully light. 6 months passed since that night at the country club. The fallout was spectacular, a complete dismantling of the toxic structure that had defined my family for decades. I turned over the high-definition audio recording and the offshore tracking documents to the federal authorities. Connor was arrested 2 weeks later. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility facing multiple felony charges for wire fraud, extortion, and grand larceny. The GoFundMe campaign was shut down by the platform, and the donations were refunded to the community members after an investigation revealed the fraudulent nature of the fundraiser. With Connor in jail and their finances completely decimated, Charles and Brenda had absolutely nowhere to go. My LLC executed the 30-day eviction notice with clinical precision. When they failed to vacate the property, I sent the county sheriffs to forcefully remove them. I legally sold the massive colonial house to a lovely young couple. I kept the $50,000 I had originally invested in the basement renovation, recouped the $250,000 I paid for the defaulted debt, and put the rest of the equity straight into my expanding investment portfolio. Jasmine, Charles, and Brenda were forced to pool whatever meager resources they could scrape together. They are now renting a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Charles was quietly asked to step down from his position as head deacon at Mount Zion Baptist Church. The community entirely excommunicated them. Without their massive house and their fake wealth, they have absolutely nothing left but each other and the bitter resentment of their own failures. I sit on the balcony of my 34th floor penthouse wearing a silk robe, watching the golden hour sun dip below the city skyline. I take a slow sip of my expensive matcha latte. The air up here is clean and entirely peaceful. I have not spoken a single word to my parents or my sister in 6 months, and my life has never been more vibrant. I look out over the horizon and realize the greatest truth I have ever learned. Blood does not make you family. Shared DNA is just a biological coincidence. True family is defined by loyalty, mutual respect, and the consistent choice to protect one another. I smile, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on my face. Have you ever had to bankrupt your toxic family lies to buy back your own peace? Let me know in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe in protecting your soft life at all costs. Remember, your peace is the most expensive thing you own. Never let anyone who refuses to value you afford a seat at your table.